The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Amanda from CCIQ. I'll be your facilitator for today, and joining me is Diana, our Manager of International Trade here at CCIQ, and her colleague Graham, who's one of the Senior International Trade Advisors here at CCIQ. Thank you for joining us for the 6th webinar in our 7-part series. Today's fundamental is on export, logistics and documentation. So there are the types of documents that you do need for exporting transactions usually depend on the type of goods that you have, and in many cases the documentation may also vary depending on the requirements of the export country or destination. So today Diana and Graham will actually discuss the documentation requirements for exporting from Australia. Now before I hand over to Diana, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box that appears on the bottom right hand side of your screen. We'll collate these and get to them as best as we can. So I'll now hand over to Diana to kick off today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 6th webinar of our webinar series, The 7 Fundamentals to Export. My name is Diana Georgieva. I'm the Manager of International Trade for the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Queensland. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce today to you part 6 of our webinar series, 7 Fundamentals to Exporting. And the focus on today's discussion will be on export logistics and export documentation. Let's get started. I have mentioned in the first 5 webinars, and I will mention it now, the reason for delivering this webinar series is to assist Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland members and the other Queensland SMEs, which are not export ready, to become export ready. Becoming export ready refers to a point where businesses are equipped with the required knowledge and skills to successfully venture into trading with international markets. CCIQ can assist your business in increasing your knowledge and capabilities in relation to each of these steps so that your business is in the best possible position for success in the overseas market. To recap quickly the last 5 webinars, in webinar 1, we discussed how to assess your product export capability and your company export capabilities. We have concluded that once you have established that you have exportable product that your company is capable of exporting, that you know your strengths you can build on and weaknesses to address, then you can move into the next step, which is organizing for exports and identifying opportunities. In webinar 2, we discussed the importance of market research, desk research and in-market research to assist you with the organizing for exports and identifying opportunities. In webinar 3, our focus was on market entry strategies and how to determine which is the right one for your business and products. In webinar 4, we discussed marketing and planning considerations, your export plan and export strategy development. In webinar 5, we have discussed the regulatory and legal requirements to consider when expanding export markets. And today, we will focus on the export logistics and the export documentation requirements to export your goods overseas. And this is the agenda for today. Our Senior Trade Advisor, Graham Roberts, will cover the export logistics in the export supply chain part of the presentation. Graham has over 20 years of freight forwarding experience, and I will be discussing the export documentation requirements. And now I'll pass you on to Graham.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to basically outline today the fundamentals of how to arrange logistics and what's involved and all the parties involved. So as per the first slide, export logistics defined is an extension of export capabilities to provide a product from Australia sold to an overseas buyer, utilising the export chain, supply chain to arrange movement of product from one jurisdiction to another, keeping in mind all the possible export and import formalities of any country parties involved. Next, the export supply chain overview represents all the main organisations and parties involved in Australia for all the steps for goods to be supplied and exported to overseas buyers. On the next slide, I'll just briefly explain the roles of most of these chain party suppliers. So The supplier or the manufacturer is generally also the exporter who provide the goods to specified requirements of an overseas buyer. The packer, generally also the exporter, unless the specific goods are unsold or they are of a perishable nature. Another important party is your permit issuing authorities, such as Australian Quarantine, also Customs. There are other different organisations that have authorities to prescribe goods for export. So permits and licences may also be required for goods to leave Australia, such as accessible goods like alcohol and petroleum. So these are also enforced by another authority, being Customs. Wine also is arranged by an authority called the Wine and Branding Corporation. There are other goods that require licences or permits due to Australian restrictions or quotas. These can be issued by Customs as well, but also other organisations of authority such as Wine Australia for wine exports. Some goods also require certification for product conditions, from ingredients to packaging of product or packaging for goods conveyance to destination. There are organisations that do carry out inspections that are recognised by the world at large, such as SGS or Bureau Veritas. Transport companies are also required, obviously, for the movement of goods from factory to place of export. Some require specialised transport, such as refrigerated transport. So if anyone needs any kind of assistance to find any transport companies that need a niche or special requirement, by all means contact CCIQ. Australian Customs and Quarantine enforce not only licensing and permit issuance, but also deal in certification for goods, generally what's called prescribed goods, generally of a perishable nature. Many Australian exports also require a destination party to have import licences and permits. If any doubt on this, please advise your commodity and destination to CCIQ to look into. For example, the export market is China. Pretty much everything that is exported to China requires an import licence or a permit. So for Quarantine to handle regulations and conditions of any prescribed goods, the importing party needs to have an import permit prior to any engagement by an Australian exporter to have Quarantine carry out appropriate export documentation to allow the logistics of the cargo. Other parties that can be required on the export supply chain are insurance companies for peace of mind if things go wrong, Chamber of Commerce for any advice on exporting goods, specialising in certificates of origin or ATA carnets for goods that move through carnet partner countries. Financial options for payment of goods would also be suggested with a bank or EFIC who represent only exporters. So my next slide basically is just a quick chain of events as to what happens with your goods from the shipper to the consignee. And so basically you've got multiple modes of transport that you can actually pick for logistics, being air freight, courier, sea freight, or sea freight full container, full or partial, as well as charter vessels for larger cargoes. The less than container load is your cargo that goes into part of a container with a lot of other export cargo. The ability to arrange that pack of container it's called a consolidation, and it's by an LCL consolidator. I would highly recommend for any LCL or air freight that you choose wisely with a freight forwarder. For air freight, I would recommend highly that you pick a forwarder that has all accreditation by all the air freight security organisations and authorities in Australia, because they're going to be able to engage with your cargo with a lot of peace of mind that you may not get with any other forwarder, because they have to prescribe to certain rules, regulations and abilities to get cargo moving from one end to another. The same thing with less than container load LCL goods, where your goods are part of other exporters in a container. I would actually pick your freight forwarder in that instance specifically by a freight forwarder that consolidates their own containers, because they know a lot about things that go wrong with cargo that goes throughout the world, especially if it transships in ports. So that would be my recommendation, definitely, for pick a freight forwarder that has their own groupage boxes. The other consideration for an appropriate freight forwarder with a successful goal of movement of your goods to the desired destination and country and place of delivery needs to be carefully regarded. This would also highly depend on what your your actual contractual arrangements are for your goods. If they're going to the door on the other end, for example, you would definitely want a freight forwarder that has the ability to have communication and help and assist with anything that happens once the cargo actually reaches the destination. So forwarders that arrange worldwide LCL consolidation usually have some idea also of barrier restrictions that are potentially going to cause your goods delay or problems. So based on those particular destinations and or commodities, they would be very helpful to assist if something needed clarifying or if something goes wrong. On the next slide, I'd just basically like to establish Incoterms and what they are. Incoterms rules are internationally recognised standard and are used worldwide in international and domestic contracts for the sale of goods. So basically each Incoterm rule defines what the importer is responsible for, but more importantly, what the exporter is responsible for. So the idea of choosing your Incoterms would be to try and see if you can reduce the amount of risk and obligation that you have to the point of getting your goods exported. So the Incoterms rules are created and published by the International Chamber of Commerce and Industry, ICC, and they are in the process of currently being revised. There is going to be a new version of Incoterms due to be published and available sometime next year in 2020. The Incoterms agreed upon will outline the responsibilities assumed by the importer and, of course, the exporter. This will also incorporate payment arrangements for goods to be exported. The Incoterms slide of all the current terms are for option for export and import to agree upon. This slide references by term all the responsibilities of the importer and, more importantly, the exporter. This slide here is a very quick depiction and representation of the responsibilities of each for the supplier and as well the consignee. So I would recommend that the most common term or easy term that people seem to agree upon, because it puts responsibility half-half in favour of the exporter and importer, would probably be CFR or CIF terms. So basically your responsibility is to supply the goods to the port of destination, and then after that point all other responsibilities are to the importer. There are a lot of industries though that have choice of particular Incoterm. So if you export and manufacture steel, for example, most of those industry people prefer ex-works terms because they don't want any risk whatsoever accompanied by them after it leaves their factory. The Chinese, if you're exporting to China, they usually want a letter of credit and as well incorporate terms of CFR or CIF. So again, the responsibility to the port on the other end. So there are many other options for terms and many other choices that you can take, but I think the hardest part with regards to Incoterms is the agreement and arrangement has to be by both parties, the importer and the exporter. And the negotiation of that can be tricky, especially when the importer is pushing you for terms that are a little bit out of your comfort zone and actually open up the risk factor to a lot greater than what it should or could be. So as well as Incoterms being something that you need very careful consideration of before any commitment is given, this slide I'm just wanting to talk about some of the things that should be considered to make sure things don't go wrong, or just be aware of things that can happen that go wrong. The circumstances of what is most appropriate and for your appropriate terms for your Incoterms vary on the country of destination. It varies also on the importer and the culture and the exporter commodity. If there's any doubts in these regards or you need any advice, please ask CCIQ to assist so that we can certainly clarify any points based on country, commodity, importer needs or culture. The most appropriate choice though is to try and mitigate the least amount of risk exposed for an exporter by the negotiation of the terms. Also leans heavily on the buyer, so the control there is not always so easy. Payment via letter of credit can also be fraught with peril. The letter of credit is basically payment against documents, and if you're using a letter of credit, so if you're dealing with pretty much anywhere in the world, like India or China even, there are two real main points of concern. The first one is understanding how to read a letter of credit and to definitely make sure on it that there is a stipulation for a discrepancy cost. Because if there isn't one, then if anything goes wrong, you could lose your entire payment and your cargo because it's already on the water. The other one is to just make sure that your bank is actually happy to deal with the foreign bank in another destination or jurisdiction. If you're exporting goods to Bangladesh, for example, and you're under a letter of credit, you'll be very hard pressed to find a bank that will approve or process your letter of credit. So there are trade barriers and restrictions that do come in manner of many different forms. It's really hard to locate or understand or see what these barriers are. However, if you've got any individual commodities and you've got a particular target destination, it's very easy to establish what the barriers can be. The only thing is it just requires some research and understanding of where you want to export to. There are other commodities that you could think of, for example, to China, beef tripe. There's a lot of beef exporters that try and export beef tripe to China. We can't, it's banned. If you're in New Zealand, it's fine, you can export it. Recently also there was a case where an Australian manufacturer supplied the USA car market, Ram and Ford, who had been supplying this market since 2006. They had a USA customs query on their goods. Basically, they didn't want them to believe that they were of Australian manufacture and had to do an investigation to verify it because the goods had foreign components in the construction of. So just to quickly conclude, being an accidental exporter is really easy. Being a successful one who makes money, grows a business and stays out of trouble takes some real work and effort. The world of exporting in theory sounds like a very simple concept, but unfortunately this is not the case. It is an easy feat to conquer, however, but it does take a lot of very careful planning. I thank you for listening to me this afternoon. Thanks a lot and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Graham, for your comprehensive presentation. What is export documentation? The required documentation your goods to clear customs at destination. In addition, export documentation can be an attestation to the origin of the goods, which is the case with the evidence of origin documents, such as the preferential and non-preferential certificates of origin and the certified declarations of origin. Export documentation can be also evidence of the terms and conditions of a contract of carriage. The airway bill and the bill of lading are good examples for this. This is your contract with the airline carrier or with the ship in case you're not sure what exactly airway bill or bill of lading is. Export documentation can be also evidence of title of the goods, which allows the legal owner of or the consignee to collect the goods at destination. The bill of lading and the airway bills are examples for such a documentation. And finally, export documentation can be a demand for payment for goods or services, which is the case with the bill of exchange. Bill of exchange is a written order to a person to pay a specified payment to a specified payee. We will discuss this type of document in more detail in our WEX webinar, which I strongly recommend you to attend. It is going to be on financing your exports and getting paid, and EFIC and Westpac are going to actually be our co-presenters for this webinar. So I would strongly recommend you. We'll be talking also letters of credit, and that's crucial information to know how actually to comply with your letters of credits. Now let's move back to my webinar, the benefits of export documentation. And these are the key benefits of export documentation. I have outlined them for you on the screen. When it comes to export documentation classification, there are 6 distinctive categories of export documentation depending on their key functionality. These are documents required by importing countries, documents required by the Australian authorities, transportation documents, commercial documents, banking, financial institutions documents, and special documents. Referring to the image on the screen, with the exception of the documents required by the Australian authorities, the banking documents, and the transportation documents, our Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland export documentation team is involved in issuing or attesting documents from the other 3 categories. Yes, we are very busy indeed. As Grant mentioned earlier, we are the issuing body for the various types of certificates of origin and the exclusivity authority for Queensland for the issuance of ATA carnets. We certify other documents such as commercial invoice, packing list, health and halal certificates, and many others. We certify pretty much any document which is required and is legal, obviously, document from the importing country. I will discuss in more detail our export documentation and the documentation services shortly. But before to go into that, I would like to give you some examples for documents required by the export countries, which are the export permits is such an example, so is the phytosanitary certificates. The bill of lading or the airway bills are an example for transportation documents. A bill of lading or way bill is an international shipping document issued by a carrier which details a shipment of merchandise and gives title of that shipment to a specified party. You need this to be able to complete your certificates of origin when required, when you're organizing your certificate of origin with us. Speak to your freight forwarder to organize this document for you. Banking documents. The most common document we come across is the letter of credit. This is a guarantee from the importer's bank to the exporter's bank to ensure that payment is going to be made for the goods exported, provided that all the conditions of the LC are met. I have found another definition on LCs for you. A letter of credit is a letter from a bank guaranteeing that a buyer's payment to a seller will be received on time and for the correct amount. In the event that the buyer is unable to make a payment on the purchase, the bank will be required to cover the full or remaining amount of the purchase. From the Chamber of Commerce and Industry perspective, your certificates of origin has to be compliant with the LC, so as the rest of your export documentation. Please avoid making mistakes on your LCs, and it will cost you dearly. Special documentation, the ATA carnets and the certificates of free sale are good examples for this category. I'll tell you more about these documents later in today's presentation. All you need to know right now is these are issued by the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland. Commercial invoices and packing lists are good examples for commercial documentation. These are issued by you, the exporter, or your freight company on your behalf. You might find that the Middle Eastern countries require attestation for similar documents from the authorized authority, such as the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland, and we can attest this at our end. Importing country documentation requirements. Typical example is the certificate of origin, which is the documentary evidence of your origin of your goods. We will discuss the various types of certificates of origin shortly. All you need to know right now is that if you have any export documentation questions, please contact your freight company or our office. Our experienced trade advisors will help you all the way. I would like to focus your attention now on the Australian Free Trade Agreements, FTAs, and the documentation requirements of these FTAs. I will briefly cover which are the current FTAs, rules of origin requirements, and the four-step process how to benefit from the reduced tariff rates negotiated in the Australian FTAs. Let's start with the current FTAs. By definition, a free trade agreement, an FTA, is an international treaty that reduces barriers to trade and investment. Australia has 11 FTAs in force. The bilateral Australia-New Zealand FTA, Singapore-Australia FTA, Australia-United States FTA, Thailand-Australia FTA, Australia-Chile FTA. Australia has a multilateral free trade agreement with New Zealand and the ASEAN economies. This is the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand FTA, which country participants are Australia, Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. Australia also has bilateral FTAs with Malaysia, Korea, Japan, and China. The most recent Australian FTA is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. The country signatories are Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, Mexico, Canada, Vietnam, Malaysia, Chile, Peru, and Brunei. What do FTAs have to do with today's topic of export documentation, you may ask? There are evidence of origin documentation associated with these FTAs, certificates of origin or the equivalent document. Obtaining the certificate of origin is the final step of a four-step process you need to be aware of, and the exporter must have the answers to three main points before going ahead and obtaining the certificates of origin. Each FTA has specific provisions and products negotiated under the FTA. However, when it comes to the process on how to benefit from the FTAs in terms of tariff reduction, it is a similar process across all. We are referring to these four main steps. Step 1, identifying the correct HS code of the product you will be exporting. Once you have done this, you will be able to determine how your product is treated under the FTA, which is step 2. Country parties of an FTA have their commitment set in tariff elimination schedules. By logging on the Department of Foreign Affairs Free Trade Agreement portal, ftaportal.dfat.gov.au, using your product HS code or keyword, you can see the tariffs applicable, so as the tariff elimination schedules for your product. Step 3, determine whether your goods meet the FTA rules of origin requirements. These are agreed criteria used to ensure that only goods that meet the FTA origin criteria receive free trade agreement preferential rates of custom duties as per the importing country tariff elimination schedule. For example, Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, JEPA, only goods originating in Australia or Japan are entitled to preferential treatment under JEPA. And please note that the origin criterion is different for each FTA, so you really have to have understanding of the rules of origin before completing the certificate of origin. Otherwise, will be no issuing of certificate of origin at our end, because we don't want your goods actually to be stuck at port and not to have the correct documentation in place. For additional information of rules of origin, please refer to the relevant rules of origin section in the free trade agreements, or refer to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Free Trade Agreement portal I've mentioned earlier, or the easiest way, just contact us for assistance. The final step, step 4, is obtaining the relevant certificate of origin from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland to benefit from the lower rates for tariffs under the relevant FTA. Here is why you need the relevant preferential certificate of origin in the case of Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, and certification origin in the case of CPTPP. I have used one product example, chilled boneless beef. Export to Japan, what you can see on the screen is tariff elimination schedule for the product under 2 FTAs. The export has a choice between 2, simply because Japan is part of 2, as I've mentioned earlier. If you compare the products across the 2 FTAs, you will find that CPTPP gives greater tariff advantage. Regardless of your FTA preference, if you export under JEPA, with the JEPA certificate of origin, currently your importer is entitled to the reduced tariff rate of 28.8% versus the base tariff rate of 38.5%, which was the case before the FTA to take into place. If your choice is to export under CPTPP, with CPTPP certification of origin, currently your importer is entitled to 26.6 tariff rate versus the base tariff of 38.5%. As you can clearly see, there is a substantial tariff advantage to use the applicable origin document. The use of the relevant certificate of origin or alternative documentary evidence of origin document is also a requirement of the FTAs, so you can't avoid it. I realize this is a complex topic, but please contact our experienced international trade team to help you with your HS codes, FTA's tariff benefits analysis for your product, FTA's rules of origin requirements, and certificates of origin requirements. This slide may look familiar to those of you who attended our previous webinar on regulatory and legal requirements to consider when preparing for export. We mentioned then that you may find that when exporting commodities overseas, on many occasions, you will be asked to provide proof of the country of origin for the goods exported. This is especially the case with the free trade agreements Australia has with other countries, where specific rules of origin are applicable. Without the documentary evidence of origin, such as the relevant certificate of origin, your importer will not be able to benefit from the reduced tariffs for your product applicable to the relevant free trade agreement. We have also acknowledged that the documentary evidence of origin, certificates of origin, and certified declarations of origin are the 2 common types requested by customs. Certificates of origin is a documentary evidence that the goods are originating from Australia. Certified declaration of origin is a documentary evidence that the goods are originating from another country than Australia. CDO is used for similar goods re-exported from Australia. Let's say, for example, you have a machinery imported from China and you decide this, for whatever reason, to re-export this machinery to the States. In this case, you're going to require certified declaration of origin because the product is of Chinese origin, so you can't use certificate of Australian origin. Certified declaration of origin will be the right document to use. CCQ specializes in certificates of origin. We service over 1,700 Queensland businesses with over 70,000 certificates of origin annually. We issue preferential associated with the various free trade agreement certificates of origin, and we also issue non-preferential certificates of origin. The preferential certificates of origin are the Thailand-Australia Free Trade Certificate of Origin, TAFTA, the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement Certificates of Origin, AANZFTA, Australia-Chile Free Trade Agreement Certificate of Origin, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Australia-Korea Free Trade Agreement Certificates of Origin for CAFTA, Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement Certificates of Origin for JIPA, and Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry China, Australia Free Trade Agreement Certificate of Origin, TAFTA, and the most recent one for Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership Certification of Origin for CPTPP. The non-preferential certificates of origins are also used to verify the origin of the goods to customs. However, in general, the importer cannot use this for reduction in tariffs. You may find that with the FTAs, the preferential certificates of origin are a requirement of the FTA, as I mentioned earlier. Here, I would like to mention also that the certified declaration of origin is also a documentary evidence of origin. And as I've mentioned previously, it is used for goods which are from non-Australian origin but exported from Australia. One more thing I would like to mention for this slide, and we'll move on. We have two ways of issuing certificates of origin and certified declarations of origin. We have electronic certification, which is within 2 hours service. All you need to do is to register without one of the 2 electronic services providers we utilize, eCertify or Trace Stylus. And you can do this by calling us or just log on our website and follow the prompts. And also manual certification. By manual, we're referring to export documentation emailed to our email exportdocs@ccq.com.au. We will process the documents within the same day, and you have the alternative of sending a courier, or we can send them by express post to your premises, whatever it's easier for you to save your time and money. What you can see on the screen is just one example of Australian Chamber of Commerce JIPA Certificate of Origin. I picked one. I don't want to bore you today with a whole heap of templates, but you'll get it. Pretty much, you have similar sections to complete in the different certificates of origin for the different FTAs, but the meaning is different. And they're different templates. Each template is different on its own rights. The example for JIPA, for example, and for all the rest of them, you will need your shipping documents to be able to complete the information. And don't forget the 3 steps before to go to the certificate of origin completion. You need to identify the correct HS code of the product you'll be exporting. You need to understand how your product will be treated under the FTA. You need to determine whether your goods meet the FTA rules of origin requirements. And otherwise, you wouldn't be able to complete the certificate of origin, in this case JIPA, but it's also relevant for the other certificates of origin for the various free trade agreements Australia has with other countries. Assistance is available at any time for your certificates of origin preparation journey. We will send you the right forms, we will send you the application forms for the various free trade agreements, we will register you for the various free trade agreements, and you will have your service in no time, within 2 hours processing service for electronic submissions, and the same date within 24 hours for the manual certification. Let's give you a hypothetical example. If you decide to create your own certificate, which some free trade agreements allow that, Japan Economic Partnership Agreement is one of them. Customs in Japan reject the certificate due to a discrepancy and advises your customer, the importer, that they cannot clear the cargo without the correct documentation, or they have to pay the full custom duties versus the preferential duties negotiated in the free trade agreement simply because they don't have the correct document. You look at the discrepancy, is the wrong rule of origin, what do? You contact us to help you. It's very hard for us to help you because this is not our certificate of origin, so we don't really have a case. However, if it is our document, certificates, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland and the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we have protocol and processes in place. So if your certificate of origin is rejected at destination, we will need to know who is the rejecting officer, what is which port was rejected, what is the official reason for rejection. Then we will escalate to Australian Chamber of Commerce, and they will escalate with Department of Foreign Affairs, the issue to be investigated at the customs port level. Can you see the difference? You will have a very fast solution and your cargo will be released in no time. So I would strongly recommend you to contact our international trade team and to issue your certificates of origin with us versus trying to venture into situations which can be challenging sometimes and risk involved as well. In addition to certificates of origin and certified declarations of origin, I have outlined what other services our export documentation team provides. We can also assist you with certificates of resale, which is required sometimes at destination, and we can also attest other export documentation, which also can be required at destination. I think I mentioned earlier that the Middle Eastern countries, they require very oftenly the commercial invoices and packing list to be authorized, certified by us as well, in addition to other authorities. So when you have commercial invoices, packing lists for the Middle East, consider that they need additional certification from attestation from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland. One document I would like to pay a little bit more attention today is the ATA cardnet. The ATA cardnet is your passport for the goods. It's like we travel overseas with our passports. That's similar for the goods. ATA cardnet is a document which is considered as the most comprehensive document in international trade. However, we are the issuing body of ATA cardnets and will guide you all through the process of how to complete the relevant documentation so there is no issues at destination. If you're thinking, for example, of taking goods to international trade shows with the aim of returning the goods back to Australia within 1 year, then cardnet is definitely the way to go to avoid custom duties and taxes. Contact our office for assistance when you're planning your next trade show, exhibition, racing cars or jet ski events, filming the TV production overseas, or any other commercial activity involving goods for temporary export. And with this, I will conclude our export documentation services portfolio for the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland. Mistakes to avoid when it comes to your export documentation and certificates of origin: wrong origin criterion. What we incur quite actually regularly is some of our customers include Australia as an origin criterion. Please note, Australia is not an origin criterion. Refer to the individual FTA rules of origin requirements to establish the right origin criterion for the right free trade agreement, or just give us a call or have a look at the FTA portal, or you can come to our office and speak to any of our trade specialists to guide you through the process. Missing content. There is a reason why the individual certificates of origin fields exist. If you don't understand, just please ask us. One of the most common reasons customs gives us for certificates being rejected at destination is the exporter not including the overleaf notes as part of the certificate of origin, or scanning your certificate and emailing it to overseas importer. Both cases are a big no-no. Missing overleaf notes is a non-compliance with the evidence of origin part of evidence of origin part of the free trade agreements, and the scanned certificates of origin are not perceived as originals. Once you receive your certificate of origin from us, your importer requires the original document. So please try not to do shortcuts on this method because it could be costly. And finally, print your certificates of origin in color and double-sided where this is applicable to avoid rejection at destination. And if you have any questions, you have a 10 people experienced Chamber of Commerce export documentation international trade team to answer all your questions and to help you through the process. I will conclude today's presentation with industry contacts that can assist you with your export venture in all different aspects of your export venture. You don't have to try to figure it out on your own. Assistance is available. Contact our office for assistance. We can also introduce you to our colleagues from Austrade, Trade Investment Queensland, EFIC, and other strategic partners we work with to help you succeed internationally. And this is it for today, our second last installment on the 7 fundamentals of successful exporting. And this will conclude the presentation for today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We do have time just to ask a couple of questions. First one for you, Graham. How do I choose a freight forwarder?
Hi, Amanda. Thanks for that. Look, it's a really complex question, but you seem to really need to base it on the nature of what your goods are, where they're going, as well as consideration is, do you need your forwarder to have any kind of role at the destination for clearance? So there's a lot of things to consider, but I can make a few recommendations. So if your goods were perishable and moving air freight, for example, I would definitely recommend a couple of forwarders, DHL or CT Freight would be good options. They also have the ability to engage destination requirements as well. If your cargo is general air or sea freight cargo, there's a couple of organisations, one Cargo Transport, another is 20 Cube. That'd be pretty sound options. Cargo Transport, for example, though, if something goes wrong at the destination and you need some help, they really know how to deal with issues on the other end, and they deal with some difficult countries like Colombia and others in South America. And I also recommend that when you do engage in a forwarder, I would pick 3 of them for quotes and services, and not only just to see what's out there as far as costing is concerned, but also just to compare what they actually want to offer and engage in you. The last piece of advice I would give for that is any good forwarder that can provide services to one part of the world, I don't think it would be a recommendation or a guarantee that they will have the same service to a completely different part of the world. So again, it's a difficult answer to the question. There's many things to consider. Thanks.
Excellent. Some great tips there, Graham. Diana, I have a question for you. I'm planning to export to Thailand some machinery which is made in Australia. Which free trade agreement is most beneficial?
That's a good question, Amanda. Thailand is part of 2 free trade agreements, Thailand-Australia Free Trade Agreement and AANZFTA. We need to know the HS code of your machinery to confirm. We also need to confirm with you the exact origin, because most likely there will be foreign components from other countries than Australia or Thailand. And what is the percentage of non-originating materials? So to see whether the good qualifies actually as originating under either of these free trade agreements, and then we can conduct the tariff benefits comparison to see which FTA will be more beneficial for your product. Just please contact our office and we'll help you through the process.
Okay, one of our listeners is exporting product to New Zealand. Do they need to process a certificate of origin?
To New Zealand? Yes, absolutely. New Zealand is part of ASEAN Free Trade Agreement Australia has with the ASEAN economies in New Zealand. With New Zealand, you have a choice of ASEAN Certificate of Origin, and you have a choice also of non-preferential Certificate of Origin as well, depending of what actually are the applicable tariffs to your product. So we have to have a look at the product. What is the product? Again, we're going back to the HS code and to the actual product to see whether your product is covered under AANZFTA, because if it's not covered, you may be able to use a non-preferential Certificate of Origin.
Okay, question for Graham. How do I check if my goods are going to be okay to export to a particular country, and how do I determine what conditions are required at destination?
Thanks, Amanda. Look, unfortunately, with that query, it's very difficult to give any kind of specific answer without knowing your commodity and also where in the world it's going and what conditions on the other end are applicable. And that also really applies if your commodity is perishable versus manufactured versus whatever different type of commodity is. So I would really request, if you could, if you've got a particular product that you have or products and you've got somewhere in the world that you want to export them to, by all means, please contact us and we can investigate what kind of conditions are required and what kind of options that you actually have. Thanks.
Okay, and just one last question around the carnets. Is there cost involved to issue one, Diana?
Yes, there are two costs. One is the preparation fees, and the second one is the security bond. The security bond is refundable upon the return of the carnet and that all the conditions are met, so there is no discrepancies in this carnet. So it's a little bit of a complex topic, though I would suggest to contact our office for the schedule of fees because there are a few components involved in calculating the preparation fees, and the security bond is 50% of the total items or the equivalent amount of the import duties payable. So as you can see, it's no straightforward answer. Just contact our office to determine the right costing.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Diana and Graham, for presenting today. And thank you for everyone who has joined us. Before we finish up, I just want to mention that registrations for the 2019 Asia Pacific Cities Summit and Mayors Forum are now open. The event is held in Brisbane from the 7th to the 10th of July. For those that don't know, haven't heard about this event, it's in its 20th year, and it's a hub for cities in the region to share ideas and solutions and to collaborate internationally. So it's a fantastic event, and everyone who registered for the webinar will receive 50% off the ticket. So I'll send out a link to that in today's follow-up email along with a copy of the webinar recording and the presentation slides. Also, don't forget to register for the final webinar in the Fundamentals series, which is about getting paid and export support and resources. It's on June 27. We'll have two special guests from EFIC and Westpac, so we will send you a link to this as well. Thanks for joining us today on behalf of CCIQ. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.